Welcome to Lecture 10, the final lecture of this semester, and a good bridge to the next semester when the global online negotiation will put you at the negotiating table as a delegate to work out with fellow citizens around the world a meaningful climate agreement for 2015. One that I count on us being able to deliver and to say to the world leaders, here it is, here is a kind of agreement you should have, and if you don't come up with it, well, the world citizens have. So I'm looking forward to participating together with you as delegates to the global online negotiation next semester. And therefore, in this 10th and final lecture of this semester, I'd like to talk about the structure of the negotiations at COP21, how they can produce a meaningful agreement, an agreement to achieve the 2 °C limit on mean global temperature increase. And to do that, in this chapter 1, I want to talk about a kind of structure, a 3-tiered structure for an actual agreement. Now, these 3 tiers are not the only parts of a climate agreement. Indeed, in further chapters of this lecture, I'll talk about some of the other parts of an agreement in terms of financing, for instance. But here I want to talk about the logic of an agreement on mitigation. What would it mean to agree to a 2 °C limit for the world as a whole? And for that purpose, let's go back to the 3 kinds of interactions that I discussed in Lecture 9. The poker game, the brainstorming around the table, and the conductorless orchestra, because I think that all 3 have some role in the negotiations. What's being discussed now mostly is the poker game. That's been the tradition of the negotiations up until now. What are we going to agree to? How do I make sure, as representing country 1, that I'm not giving up something relative to country 2? And we're going to have that kind of bargaining, no doubt, and we'll have absolutely that spirit to some unavoidable extent, also to some logical extent, to make sure that the commitments are shared. The first tier of any agreement is likely to be some legally binding contributions or commitments of countries in the relatively short term, say up to the year 2030. The agreement to be reached next year will only take force, most likely, by around 2018 and maybe begin its period of implementation around 2020. And perhaps the next phase envisioned within an agreement would be 2030. Governments are saying to others, what are you ready to put on the table that is a firm commitment on emissions levels across the greenhouse gases, and that can be monitored, reported, verified, and that will be binding for you. Now, that's the poker game. It is not going to deliver a 2 °C ambition. Why? First, it's too short term for that. In order to deeply decarbonize, we're going to need decades, not decade. So any real deep decarbonization program needs to have a horizon well beyond 2030 to mid-century and even beyond, because we know that if our goal is to reduce global emissions of carbon dioxide by 2050 to, say, between 10 and 15 billion tons, we're going to need, as a world, to reduce net emissions to nearly 0 or to 0 net emissions perhaps by 2070 to 2080. So the tier is going to have to give us a longer term framework to begin with. 2030 can never do it. The other problem with focusing only on the short term in that baseline poker game is that it can trick you. It can lead countries to short-term improvements that are kinds of dead ends, that are limited progress but have a lock-in effect that don't allow the countries to go further. This is evident in the United States with some of the sentiment right now to shift from coal-fired power plants not to wind or solar or nuclear or zero-emitting electricity, but to natural gas. And the argument is, well, that's an improvement. Going from coal to gas, that's a good thing. And that would be built, say, into a 2030 scenario. The problem with that, however, is that while gas burns more cleanly than coal, an economy based on natural gas is not an economy consistent with the 2 C limit. It would be emitting far, far more than would be permissible under a carbon budget of 2 degrees centigrade. So the second tier has to be longer term. And of course, given our experience in the Deep Decarbonization Pathways project, we feel quite strongly from our own experience and from the logic of the project itself that every country should put forward a deep decarbonization pathway at least to the mid-century. Those DDPPs are a little bit like the score that is on the musician's stand in the conductorless orchestra. That is the music that will be played. It's not music under a contract that says you play that, that's legally binding and verified. More, it is the theme music that together around the world, countries will play in order to make the sounds of 2 degrees C. In other words, to make the music that can really change the direction of the temperature and the energy system. It is, to put it in other terms, part of that thinking through an implementation process. How can we really get to where we need to go? Now, there's a third part of this puzzle around the table, and that's the fact that we don't have solutions at hand that are quite good enough for what we're going to need. Again, in the Deep Decarbonization Pathway project, many country teams had a very, very difficult time to have their models combine the assumed quite rapid economic growth for the developing countries, for example, and the deep decarbonization together with that growth. And when the models were pushed on that, the model said our technological assumptions are rather cautious, rather static. If we're going to be able to decarbonize more deeply, of course, we're going to need breakthroughs on technology. This should be the third tier of an agreement. If the first tier is for the short horizon, legally binding, the second tier is the pathways for the middle of the century, the third tier or component of an agreement is a serious worldwide effort to make breakthroughs on technology, what is called the RDD&D framework, the research, development, demonstration, and diffusion framework. This is not the kind of agreement, unfortunately, that has been negotiated in the past. When one looks at the Kyoto Protocol or the drafts that were circulated for Copenhagen, or even the discussions that are underway now, the components that I've just outlined of short-term, legally binding contributions, intermediate run pathways, and a major constructive effort on technology has not really been a framework in place. And one can see in the tensions that result, the failure to have that integrated frame has made it very difficult to reach agreements on any particular component. Countries resist being pushed farther in terms of legally binding commitments beyond what they feel is already sure and available technologically. Without the technology building component, we also will not develop those improvements that will open up the space for much deeper action. And yet, without the pathways that guide us and tell us that it's not enough to go from coal to natural gas, but we have to go from coal to zero carbon electricity or nearly so, without those pathways, then we don't even have guidelines on what the technological needs and obstacles that we must overcome really are. So it's that integrated framework that is the kind of framework that can carry us forward. In the next chapters, let's look more deeply at the issues of technology, the issues of finance, and the issues of public mobilization in support of a bold agreement.